Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy, where we bring you the stories behind the health headlines.
This podcast is brought to you by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Body Cream. 800-345-7339, on the web at uttercream.com. Americans spend more than $350 billion a year on medications. Some new drugs cost thousands a month. Are we getting our money's worth? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Are you tired of prescription drug commercials on television urging you to ask your doctor if drug X, Y, or Z is right for you? Why do we take so many pills anyway?
Today we talk with Dr. Peter Gøtzsche. He used to be a drug company insider, but now he's one of the strongest critics of the pharmaceutical industry. He teaches clinical research design and directs the Nordic Cochrane Center in Copenhagen.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, find out if Big Pharma has corrupted healthcare.
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy health headlines, a new study suggests that appendicitis doesn't always need to be treated with surgery. The research report is a bit confusing, but the results are fascinating. Finnish investigators recruited 530 patients with acute, uncomplicated appendicitis. Their condition was confirmed with CT imaging, the gold standard for an appendicitis diagnosis. These people were randomly assigned to undergo immediate appendectomy or to receive a broad-spectrum antibiotic to knock out the infection underlying the inflammation. The follow-up period lasted a year. The results were quite encouraging. Of 257 people assigned to get antibiotic treatment, only 70 required surgery for persistent or recurrent appendicitis. None of those who got antibiotics first and then required surgery developed complications as a result of the delay. An editorial in JAMA that accompanied this research concluded that the time has come to consider abandoning routine appendectomy for patients with uncomplicated appendicitis.
MRIs, or magnetic resonance imaging, are considered much safer than CT scans that require ionizing radiation. It's estimated that 20 million MRIs are conducted in the U.S. each year. One aspect of these scans is now under scrutiny. About a third of MRIs involve injections of a contrast agent to make the resulting images clearer. Some contrast agents contain gadolinium, a rare earth chemical element. An investigative report from ProPublica reveals that some products, Omniscan and Magnavist, are associated with gadolinium residues in brain tissue after imaging. The first problem noted with gadolinium was kidney toxicity. Nephrogenic systemic fibrosis can be life-threatening, and in 2007 the FDA put a black box warning on these contrast agents for patients with kidney impairment. An editorial in the journal Radiology calls for reevaluation of previous assumptions of safety of the gadolinium compounds in such contrast agents.
New research shows that trans fats are bad for the brain. Dr. Beatrice Golum and her colleagues interviewed more than 1,000 adults. The study volunteers filled out dietary questionnaires and took memory tests that required word recall. The results showed that high levels of trans fats in the diet were linked to worse performance on the memory test in middle-aged men. For each additional gram of trans fats in their food, these men scored about 3/4 of a word lower on average. According to Dr. Golum, trans fats were most strongly linked to worse memory in men during their high productivity years. She tells her patients, while trans fats increase the shelf life of foods, they reduce the shelf life of people.
This week, the Food and Drug Administration announced that it's finally ready to ban trans fats from American foods. You might have assumed that trans fats had already disappeared, since there's strong evidence that trans fat consumption contributes to heart attacks. Although many food manufacturers have removed this man-made fat, it can still be found in some baked goods, frostings, margarines, non-dairy creamers, and snack foods such as chips or microwave popcorn. In addition, some fried foods, refrigerated dough for biscuits, cookies, or frozen pizza contain trans fats, also referred to as partially hydrogenated vegetable oils. The FDA asserts that a complete ban on trans fats should prevent 20,000 heart attacks annually and as many as 7,000 deaths. Given such statistics, one might assume the ban would go into effect immediately. In actuality, the Food and Drug Administration is giving the food industry 3 years to implement the total ban. That means thousands more heart attacks and deaths are likely to occur until trans fats completely disappear from the food supply.
One treat that people need not avoid any longer is chocolate. A new study confirms previous suspicions that eating chocolate can reduce the risk of heart disease. Scientists at the University of Aberdeen collected dietary data from more than 20,000 people in the course of 12 years. Approximately 20% of these folks never ate chocolate. Those who did eat chocolate daily had an 11% lower risk of developing cardiovascular disease and a lower risk of dying from a heart attack. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The pharmaceutical industry is one of the most successful businesses in the world. Turn on television and you'll doubtless see commercials for some of their best-selling products, from Cialis to Zyprexa.
But how does this financial success affect healthcare? Patients, hospitals, and insurance companies are reeling from the high cost of life-saving new medicines. Has Big Pharma corrupted healthcare?
We're talking today with Dr. Peter Gøtzsche, Professor of Clinical Research Design and Analysis at the University of Copenhagen. He co-founded the Cochrane Collaboration in 1993 and is currently director of the Nordic Cochrane Center. He's a specialist in internal medicine who worked in clinical trials and regulatory affairs in the pharmaceutical industry between 1975 and 1983. His book is Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime: How Big Pharma Has Corrupted Healthcare.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Gøtzsche.
Thank you.
Dr. Gøtzsche, it would be an understatement to say that you are critical of the pharmaceutical industry, and yet you are actively involved in drug trials and regulatory affairs for the pharmaceutical industry for many years. Why have you turned around and bitten the hand that fed you?
Well, I haven't turned around. I was critical towards what the industry was doing back then when I worked for the industry. I hadn't been there for long before I realized I needed to get out again, because what was done in the industry, in my opinion, was unethical.
Dr. Gøtzsche, what do you mean by unethical?
Well, I saw very early that the marketing messages that the company I worked for were misleading, sometimes quite much. And the whole idea was to train doctors to use drugs that patients didn't really need, and then to use them at as high doses as possible, because that meant more sales. But it also meant more harm. And one of the drugs I worked with is certainly very harmful, because that was an arthritis drug. It was called naproxen.
Naproxen, I think some people who are familiar with arthritis drugs were expecting you to say maybe rofecoxib, which was known as Vioxx. That was clearly a harmful drug. Naproxen is usually thought of as a not particularly harmful drug, especially here in the U.S., where it's available without a prescription.
Under the name Aleve.
Oh, my goodness. Naproxen is available in your country without prescription?
Absolutely. And it, I'm sorry to say, is very widely marketed.
It is not only widely marketed, but it is one of the most popular pain relievers in the drugstore.
But this is terrible. We have known for very many years that in the United States, around 20,000 people die each year because of bleeding stomach ulcers caused by arthritis drugs like naproxen. And a drug like naproxen has many other harmful effects. It can kill you in very many ways. So we should not use these drugs very much. We can use paracetamol for many of these pains that people use naproxen and ibuprofen for, and paracetamol won't kill you.
I would like to translate for our audience. You're speaking English, no problem with that. But some of our listeners won't be aware that paracetamol is what we call acetaminophen, which is the main ingredient in Tylenol.
Oh, yes, yes.
Now, I am going to take exception. I apologize for this, Dr. Gøtzsche, but acetaminophen can kill. If you take too much, if you consume alcohol at the same time, it can do some damage to your liver.
Of course, I agree completely. But arthritis drugs kill far more people than Tylenol does. And we should avoid painkillers as much as we can. But if we need some, I think Tylenol is less dangerous than all the arthritis drugs.
Now, a lot of people have heard that the arthritis drugs like ibuprofen, like naproxen, like diclofenac can be tough on the digestive tract, and you already mentioned bleeding ulcers. But there are some other complications as well, in particular cardiovascular. Can you tell us about them?
Yes, that is a terrible story. The newer COX-2 inhibitors were supposed to have less gastrointestinal side effects, but we knew all along from the mechanism of action that these drugs must cause thrombosis, so they must lead some people to die from heart attacks. And yet the Food and Drug Administration didn't require any studies that could tell us just how deadly these drugs were. And this is a scandal because it needed only 800 people in the age group that usually take these drugs, the elderly, and then we would have known just how deadly Vioxx was. But there wasn't ever any requirement of showing this. And in my estimation, Vioxx alone has killed around 120,000 people in this world. And by far, most of these people didn't need the drug in the first place because it was sold for everything. Tennis elbow, back pain, I don't know what, where you either didn't need a drug or could just take Tylenol.
Dr. Gøtzsche, we've been talking up until just now when we switched over to COX-2 inhibitors, we've been talking about drugs that are sold in the U.S. without a prescription, but you've suggested that prescription drugs are the third leading cause of death after heart disease and cancer. Can you explain that, please?
Yes, it's a terrifying fact, and it is unfortunately true. I have seen studies both from America and from Norway and the European Union, and they point to the same, that it seems to be the third leading cause of death. Some people have called it the fourth leading cause of death, but that doesn't really matter. It is a very important cause of death. And arthritis drugs are certainly among these drugs that kill very many people. And another drug group that kills very many people are psychiatric drugs. And people don't really seem to be aware just how dangerous these drugs are.
Professor Gøtzsche, you have compared drug companies to tobacco companies. That's a pretty strong statement. Why?
Because there is a similar repugnant disregard for human lives in both industries. It just doesn't matter how many people your product kills, as long as it doesn't come too often on the front page of our newspapers and in TV news. It just doesn't matter. And both industries have tried all along to conceal the lethal harms of their products, and they have lied repetitively about their products, even in Congress and at hearings at the Food and Drug Administration. and also cheated and manipulated with the research. So there are many, many similarities between these two industries. And actually, there isn't any big difference in how many people these industries kill. The tobacco industry in the Western world kills about twice as many as our prescription drugs.
Professor Gøtzsche, I have to remind our listeners that you are a physician, an internist, that you worked within the pharmaceutical industry. You were involved in clinical trials and regulatory affairs. So you've been inside this industry and you've seen how it works. In fact, you have one of the chapters in your book titled Confessions from an Insider. How have your colleagues responded to your muckraking efforts?
That has been very interesting because my colleagues have responded very positively. Of course, there have been a few, mostly those on industry payroll, that have not responded positively, but many of my colleagues among professors, for example, have told me that if only we could have been equally brave as you are, then we would have done the same thing, but we cannot really do this because we are dependent on industry money for our research and so on. So people have actually been happy about that I have revealed all these things in my book.
Professor Gøtzsche, you mentioned there are hidden harms and fraudulent behavior that the industry somehow has managed to cover up. How did that happen?
Well, the reason it happens is very simple. Crime pays. And any economist will tell you that when crime pays in a capitalistic society or in any other society, you will see more crime. And this is exactly what we have seen, that the big crimes in the pharmaceutical industry have just increased because the fines, even the billion-dollar fines they get in America, it's just a small fraction of what they earn on their crimes. And that's why you see cheating all over the place, not only in marketing, but also cheating with research where some deaths are never reported or some heart attacks are never reported, which we saw with Vioxx. And every area I have studied, I have found the same, that there is cheating all over the place.
You're listening to Dr. Peter Gøtzsche, Professor of Clinical Research Design and Director of the Nordic Cochrane Center in Copenhagen. His book is Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime: How Big Pharma Has Corrupted Healthcare.
After the break, we'll find out how inhalers in New Zealand were causing asthma deaths.
How can drug regulatory agencies stay on top of this powerful industry?
Why won't the FDA release bioequivalency data for generic drugs?
Is there anything wrong with outsourcing drug testing to other countries?
Are drug companies gaming the system by running as many trials as they like and throwing out the studies that don't get the results they're after?
How effective are medications, for example, antidepressants, when you look at the raw data from clinical trials?
Are drug ads just an annoyance, or are they a danger to public health?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you like this podcast of The People's Pharmacy and want to continue the conversation, you can join us online at facebook.com/People's Pharmacy to share your thoughts or comments. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by Redx Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. 800-345-7339. Online at uttercream.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 997. That number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today on The People's Pharmacy, we're talking about the pharmaceutical industry from the perspective of an insider who's now an outsider.
Our guest is Dr. Peter Gøtzsche, professor of clinical research design and analysis at the University of Copenhagen. He co-founded the Cochrane Collaboration in 1993 and is currently director at the Nordic Cochrane Center. He's a specialist in internal medicine who worked in clinical trials and regulatory affairs in the pharmaceutical industry between 1975 and 1983. His book is titled Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime: How Big Pharma Has Corrupted Healthcare.
Dr. Gøtzsche, you write about asthma deaths being caused by asthma inhalers. This is a very interesting story, and I think it will come as a surprise to many listeners. Can you tell us about it, please?
It is a very interesting story because we tend to believe that when we know something about the mechanism of action of a drug, we can also predict whether that drug will be helpful for people. So it was a surprise that a drug that could help asthma patients breathe, that this drug actually killed them. But it has been very well documented that this is what happened, and the researcher who found this out was harassed to an incredible extent, even by the authorities where he lived in New Zealand. So it's a terrible story that often the whistleblowers have a very bad fate.
You are referring, if I'm not mistaken, to epidemiologist Neil Pearce, is that right?
Yes, it's Pearson, yes.
And can you tell us a little bit about this story? Because it really is indicative of how the industry really tried to suppress this information.
Bits of this story are that Boehringer Ingelheim, the company, was a major funder of asthma research in New Zealand, which meant that the whistleblower had his asthma specialist against him. And not even that, but the Ministry of Health in New Zealand didn't support the whistleblower. They supported the company that went to the ministry before the whistleblower did, and they demanded of him that he delivered the data to them, and then they gave it on to Boehringer Ingelheim, the company. It is completely unethical what happened back then in New Zealand.
Dr. Gøtzsche, you mentioned that the agency that is in charge of taking care of health for New Zealanders was essentially defending the pharmaceutical industry at that point, or at least this particular company, Boehringer Ingelheim. Is this a common pattern around the world that the industry is able to somehow influence the regulatory agencies?
That is actually the story all over the world, and it's a very sad story. When we tried to get access to unpublished trial reports of the European Medicines Agency, it was denied, and the agency talked about protecting commercial interest, while we documented that all this secrecy cost the lives of an enormous amount of patients. That didn't impress them at all. So we needed to complain to the European Ombudsman, who told the European Medicines Agency that what they did was maladministration by not giving us the data, so they had to change their policy. And the director that had been so much against us, he immediately went out to a consulting company he had constructed himself, where he consulted for the drug industry, after having prevented our access for 3 years. And the story of the FDA is similar. It is full of corruption and scandals, and many times bosses at the FDA make very peculiar decisions where they overrule their own scientists that have found out that drugs are far too dangerous to bring on the market, and then they get overruled, sometimes moved to other jobs. by their bosses. It's very difficult to understand this behavior without suggesting that corruption is involved.
Well, we've been quite puzzled why the Food and Drug Administration won't release what are called bioequivalence curves for generic drugs. In other words, when a generic company comes along and tries to establish that their medicine works exactly the same way or is identical, to use the FDA's words, to the brand name drug, they have to generate these curves, the way in which the drug is absorbed into the bloodstream. But they will never release that data because they say it's proprietary, it's a trade secret, and they can't demonstrate it, and they basically say, trust us, we're the FDA, we know what we're doing. Your thoughts?
Well, we should not trust the FDA. My book is full of stories that document that we cannot trust the FDA, and it doesn't make any sense that we are not allowed to see these bioavailability studies. I have talked to a deputy commissioner at the FDA a couple of years ago when I was in Washington, and he explained to me that back in the 1970s, I think it was, a new law came by, and the FDA could choose whether they wanted a lot of secrecy or whether they wanted openness. So the law allowed both avenues, but what the FDA chose was extreme secrecy, which is an impediment for public health.
We absolutely agree that it is an impediment for public health. Another thing that concerns us is this idea that you have written about of drug trials being outsourced to other countries. Would you comment on that, please?
When drug trials are being outsourced to countries where corruption is routine, we should, of course, worry even more whether we can trust the industry's drug trials. In some of these countries, you can buy the results you want. And I would be very skeptical of seeing new drugs being approved on the basis of drug trials in these rather corrupt countries. But even drug trials in our own part of the world are often manipulated and corrupt, and it is telling that we can never get access to the raw data. Not even those doctors that have provided patients for the trials can get access to the raw data in order to check whether what the industry writes about the trial is correct. And what we really need all over the world are publicly funded drug trials, or at least public drug trials. The industry could fund them, but they should have absolutely nothing to do with them. That would make us believe more in drug trials. We just cannot believe in them today.
Well, you point out in your book that in order to get approval for a new medication, there need to be 2 randomized controlled trials, proving that the active drug is statistically better than placebo. What you also mentioned, though, is that a company can conduct as many trials as it wants to until, and I quote you, to confess. What do you mean by that?
There is an expression from America that is torture your data until they confess. And this you can do behind closed doors. And you can also do trial after trial, as you just said, until just by chance 1 or 2 trials come out positive, and then you can get your drug approved. This is absolutely crazy. And the FDA calls these trials that didn't find an effect, they call them failed trials. But what they should really say is that this is a failed drug instead, but that's not what they do. And another problem with these trials is that they are not sufficiently blinded. If you put something in the placebo that gives people side effects that are like the side effects from an active drug, then many of our drugs actually have no effect. This has been done for antidepressant drugs, the old tricyclic antidepressant drugs. If atropine was put in the placebo, there was no effect. So what is being measured in many of these trials is just bias, because the trials have not been properly blinded.
Professor Gøtzsche, there is this belief in America that antidepressant medications are miracle medicines, that they save lives, and that they are highly effective. What does your research show?
My research and other people's research show that this is totally wrong. First of all, if you put something in the placebo, for example, atropine, that gives people dry mouth, like the active drugs do, then there is no longer any effect on depression of antidepressant drugs. So what we measure in these trials is mainly bias. It is not a true effect. And the reason patients and doctors think antidepressants are effective is very simple. If you don't do anything, but you are just kind to the patient and say, let's meet again in 2 and 4 weeks' time and see how it goes, then most patients would have become considerably better. So it is the natural course of the disease, the spontaneous remission that people see, and then they mistake this for a drug effect. The other thing is that we sometimes hear these drugs save lives. They don't. They kill very, very many people. If you give antidepressant drugs to people over 65 years of age, you will kill 3 out of 100 for every year they take a drug, because it influences their balance. They fall, they might break a hip, and a considerable proportion of people who break their hip, they die from it. So these drugs kill very many elderly people. And we also know that they can drive anybody into both suicide and homicide because of a very special side effect that is extreme restlessness, where people say they want to jump out of their skin. And it is particularly children and young people who are affected by these side effects and who commit suicide. But it can happen at any age, even if you give antidepressants to totally normal people, it can drive them into suicide. And what my research has shown is that these suicides have been vastly underreported, also in the randomized trials that the FDA have analyzed. So the suicide risk is far greater than people are aware of.
Dr. Gøtzsche, we have encountered, when we talk about the suicide risk with antidepressants, the usual response is people who are depressed commit suicide, and they're most likely to do it when they start feeling a little bit better. So these drugs are actually helping people feel a little bit better, and that's when they commit suicide. And we have encountered a great deal of skepticism that there is any link between an antidepressant and homicidal behavior. So you do have data to support this?
There are lots of data that support this, and it is a myth that it is the effect on the depression that drives people into suicide. We know precisely what it is. You can become psychotic when you get an antidepressant drug, and you can get this terrible restlessness that has been shown in many studies to be linked to suicide. Technically, it is called akathisia, and it also affects normal people who just took an antidepressant for fun. They have committed suicide. So there is a lot of documentation, and also documentation that these drugs can lead people into homicide for exactly the same reason, for this terrible side effect that we call akathisia. There's no doubt about this.
Professor Gøtzsche, why do we take so many medicines? I know the Japanese take a lot, but Americans really love pills. What drives such enthusiasm for medicine?
I wish Aldous Huxley was still alive. 80 years ago, he wrote Brave New World, where people could take a soma pill to make life less painful. So the dream of a quick fix for life's problems never goes away, it seems. And the drug industry prospers on this false dream that you can fix all troubles in life with a pill. And it is immensely wealthy and powerful. And we know that drug marketing is very, very effective. So I feel that drug marketing should be forbidden because it harms so many people and kills so many of them. Just like we have forbidden marketing of tobacco, why shouldn't we forbid marketing of drugs? Because when we have a good drug, doctors will use it. Marketing is not required for that.
Dr. Gøtzsche, in the United States, we have something called DTC. That stands for direct-to-consumer advertising. And so on television, in magazines, there are commercials and ads for antidepressant medications, for drugs that will solve problems with impotence, sex issues, vaginal dryness, bladder problems. It's our understanding that the only other country in the world that has these direct-to-consumer prescription drug ads is New Zealand. Your thoughts about this approach?
It has been very well documented in the research literature that this type of marketing is very harmful. People might think it is good for them, but it is not. It drives people into taking drugs they don't need, and all drugs have harms. So what these advertisements directly to the public cause is actually more harm and not more health.
You're listening to Dr. Peter Gøtzsche, Professor of Clinical Research Design and Analysis at the University of Copenhagen. He co-founded the Cochrane Collaboration in 1993, and he's currently director of the Nordic Cochrane Center. He's a specialist in internal medicine who worked in clinical trials and regulatory affairs in the pharmaceutical industry between 1975 and 1983. His book is Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime: How Big Pharma Has Corrupted Healthcare.
After the break, we'll find out if there are any drugs our guest likes.
We'll hear about his grandfather's experience with corticosteroids.
We'll also be talking about drugs that can be difficult to stop, like proton pump inhibitors or benzodiazepines. They can create a vicious cycle of rebound side effects.
Dr. Gøtzsche will tell us exactly why he compares the drug industry to organized crime.
And we'll talk about the prices of prescription drugs. Are they fair?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening to this podcast of The People's Pharmacy. If you like it, why not rate or review it in the iTunes store? We'd appreciate it. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Redx Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Foot Cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel soft and smooth. The number's 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 997. That number again, 800-732-2334. Or you can place your order online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today we're talking with a former drug company insider who's revealing the industry's dirty laundry. What secrets would Big Pharma prefer to keep under wraps?
Our guest is Dr. Peter Gøtzsche, Professor of Clinical Research Design and Analysis at the University of Copenhagen. He co-founded the Cochrane Collaboration in 1993, and he's currently the director at the Nordic Cochrane Center. He's a specialist in internal medicine who worked in clinical trials and regulatory affairs in the pharmaceutical industry between 1975 and 1983. His book is Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime: How Big Pharma Has Corrupted Healthcare.
Professor Gøtzsche, you sound very much like a therapeutic nihilist. You've been highly critical of the pharmaceutical industry. You worked within the industry, so you have an insider's perspective. But aren't there any drugs that you like?
There are lots of good drugs. I have taken antibiotics when I actually had septicemia and might have died were it not for penicillin. And antihypertensive drugs can save many lives. Statins can save lives and so on. Insulin is fantastic. We have so many good drugs. But we really need to focus on the many people who die from drugs and who didn't really need them. That is my mission here.
Tell us a little bit about your grandfather and the trouble he ran into with corticosteroids.
My grandfather was a family physician, and he received visits from drug salespeople. And although he was quite intelligent, he seemed to have trusted these people. And I think that is probably the reason that he took corticosteroids for quite some time, because a very long time ago, corticosteroids were seen as miraculous drugs, and the drug companies didn't say too much about the terrible harms they have. But for my grandfather, he lost minerals in his bones, and he broke a hip, and it took 2 years before this fracture healed. So he stayed at a hospital for a full 2 years because of his abuse of corticosteroids. So I find it likely that it was a drug company salesperson that suggested that these steroids can be used for everything, even cheering you up a bit.
Well, one of the things that we now know about corticosteroids is that it can be very difficult to stop taking them. And that seems to be true of quite a few of the most popular medications that are most widely used. We don't think of people becoming addicted, for example, to their heartburn medicine, but if they stop suddenly, their acid reflux can become much, much worse. And in fact, it was a Danish study that proved that.
And the antidepressant medications that are now being advertised for arthritis symptoms can also be hard to discontinue abruptly.
It's absolutely correct, and we have learned that at medical school. It's very basic knowledge that when you use drugs, you create some form of artificial new equilibrium, and when you suddenly stop, you will have this rebound phenomenon, as we call it, which can make the condition worse than it has ever been, even before you started to take the drug, as you just mentioned, for heartburn. And we have the same for antidepressant drugs, that half of the patients have difficulty coming off them, and quite many patients never succeed coming off them because they can get terrible withdrawal symptoms when they try to. And this is one reason why in my country, for example, we sell so many of these drugs that every one of us can be in treatment for 6 years of our entire life. This is really insane. A depression didn't last that long in the old days.
If you were to take a cynical perspective, you might conclude that the ideal drug would be one that once somebody starts taking it, let's say a benzodiazepine for anxiety, a drug like diazepam, known by the brand name Valium, or some of the newer ones like Xanax, alprazolam, that once you start down that road, that as soon as you stop taking that medication, you begin to experience anxiety and insomnia and a variety of other serious side effects. As soon as you go back on the medicines, the symptoms disappear. It seems like a vicious cycle, and one that might keep you on that medication not for weeks, months, but quite possibly for years.
This is absolutely correct. I have discussed this with quite some psychiatrists who are very good at taking people off their drugs. And they consistently tell me, some of them also work with junkies, and they consistently tell me it's much easier to stop heroin in a street junkie than to stop an antipsychotic drug or an antidepressant drug. It can take months or years to stop these psychiatric drugs, whereas the symptoms you get if you're a heroin addict, the abstinence symptoms, they are over in a matter of rather few days or a week or so. It's far easier, they say. So we need to be aware of this problem, but unfortunately few doctors have been trained in how they taper off very slowly these drugs while they are supporting the patients when they get terrible abstinence symptoms, telling them that you should not get back on your drug because that is worse than getting off the drug. So you need to go through this period of withdrawal symptoms. It requires a lot of the doctors sometimes to get the patients through this hell of withdrawal symptoms.
Well, we've actually heard from some physicians who almost imply that there is a lack of benzodiazepines and that the patient really just needs to stay on the medication for the rest of his or her life and not worry about withdrawal. But we've heard in the last couple of years the possibility that benzodiazepines may be linked to Alzheimer's disease. Your response?
That is correct. I have seen these studies, and they have convinced me that benzodiazepines increase the risk of dementia, and the other psychiatric drugs also have quite harmful long-term effects. They probably can all result in chronic brain impairment if you have taken them for a while, which means that your brain will probably be changed forever for the rest of your life, even when you get off the drugs. So these drugs are far worse than the public has ever imagined.
Dr. Gøtzsche, you compared the pharmaceutical industry to organized crime. Tell us why.
I compare the drug industry to organized crime because what they do when they do business fulfills the criteria in U.S. law for organized crime. And that is about doing the same types of crime again and again, and that can involve embezzlement, political corruption, bribery, other forms of corruption, and so on. And the biggest drug company, Pfizer, has been convicted of organized crime. The other big companies, they have settled so that they can pretend they are innocent, but since they do the same, all of them, which my research has shown, then my conclusion as a researcher is that this looks like organized crime to me.
In the U.S., there are some special tactics that law enforcement uses to try to combat organized crime. Do we need to use that type of tactic against pharmaceutical industry?
We surely need to be much tougher with the drug industries. And one of the big problems is that, unfortunately, also in the United States, the big drug companies are so big that the administrators don't dare really take them down hard because the income from drug exports is of national importance. So some people have said that Pfizer is too big to fail. Because of Pfizer's crimes, Pfizer should not be allowed to deliver drugs to Medicaid and Medicare, for example. But in your country, nothing has been done about it. You take the small fish and you don't go after the big ones because that would hurt your national economy. But what we could do is we could start putting these people behind bars, the CEOs of the big drug companies, and that would likely be rather effective.
Most Americans don't seem to realize how many billions of dollars have been spent paying fines by the pharmaceutical industry. Can you give us some sense of how much money we're talking about?
We are talking about billions. Pfizer has had a fine of more than $1 billion, and Eli Lilly and GlaxoSmithKline, the other big companies. And some companies are fined again and again because they have no respect for the fines, as they are too small compared to the income from the crime, so they just go on being fined. And Pfizer, for example, has signed several agreements with the U.S. Department of Justice, so-called corporate integrity agreement, where they promise to behave well for the next 5 years. But while they signed one of these agreements, they were busily continuing with their crimes. So they have no respect for it.
Dr. Gøtzsche, the picture that you have described for us is pretty dire. What do you suggest as a solution?
Well, my suggestions go quite far, but I also have suggestions that are more easy to accomplish. For example, not using drugs before we have studied them ourselves. When a very expensive drug comes on the market, we could say that hospitals are not allowed to use it unless they do it in a randomized trial to find out whether it's really worth to spend so much more money on it compared to another drug for the same disease. We could easily implement things like that. But in the long term, I have come to the conclusion that while capitalism can be good for many things, it is disastrous when it comes to healthcare because it creates the wrong incentives. With the monopoly the drug industry has on new molecules, they just decide themselves how much it should cost per patient, and this is untenable. This just cannot go on. And for this reason, I feel that since most of our breakthrough drugs come from publicly funded research, we might as well have a model where we have public drug companies, where it is no longer capitalistic drug companies. And if we have that, we could also price the drugs so that we not only can afford to use them ourselves, but even in less wealthy countries, they could afford to use them, which would benefit their public health. And then also secondarily ourselves, because we could have more trade with these countries.
Speaking of the cost of medications, what we have seen over the last 5 to 10 years is an escalation in price, especially for cancer drugs or hard-to-treat conditions. It's not unusual for a new cancer drug to cost $10,000 to $15,000 a month, and sometimes insurance companies won't cover it, especially if the FDA has not approved it for a particular cancer. It seems to us that this is not going to be sustainable. And we think about Alzheimer's disease. In the U.S., there are probably over 5 million people with Alzheimer's disease. If a company actually comes up with a medication that could help either control or reverse Alzheimer's disease, and people had to take it for the rest of their lives, the sky's the limit. It would probably break the bank.
You are absolutely right. And now that you mention Alzheimer's disease, I believe that there isn't a single drug that is effective of those that are on the market today. There are several drugs that have been FDA approved, but as far as I can see, they don't work at all. What we measure in these trials is just bias, because these trials have not been effectively blinded. And even with bias, the effect is very small, so it's clinically insignificant. But imagine a drug came by that really worked for Alzheimer's. I agree with you again that it would cost so much it would break our bank. So we need to do something also internationally, across borders, because the drug industry has developed into some kind of cancer that spreads everywhere in society, and it sets its own prices. It's a kind of blackmail, like when Somali pirates, they take hostages in African waters. Then they also speculate how many millions can we get per head. And the drug industry thinks in the same way. It's uncontrollable, but we need to do something.
Professor Gøtzsche, the message you would like to leave with our listeners today is what?
I would like to leave the message that drugs are much more dangerous and kill far more people than people have ever imagined. So therefore, we all need to be conservative and not take so many drugs. And we also need to remember that our doctors' knowledge about drugs has been carefully concocted by an industry that we don't trust. So we should also be skeptical towards the prescriptions we get from our doctor. And people can go on the internet and read the package inserts. And if you read package inserts, there are very many drugs you would not dare take. So that would be a great step forward. Read them before you go to the pharmacy.
Dr. Peter Gøtzsche, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Dr. Peter Gøtzsche, Professor of Clinical Research Design and Analysis at the University of Copenhagen. He co-founded the Cochrane Collaboration in 1993, and he's currently director of the Nordic Cochrane Center. He's a specialist in internal medicine who worked in clinical trials and regulatory affairs in the pharmaceutical industry between 1975 and 1983. His book is Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime, How Big Pharma Has Corrupted Healthcare. Now, Dr. Gøtzsche's advice to look up the package inserts for your medications is very good advice, and we endorse it. We do want to caution people not to stop taking any prescription medication unless and until you discuss it with your prescriber.
We'll be speaking with a pharmaceutical industry representative in the future to get the drug company's perspective on this controversial topic.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wadarsky engineers the program. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible by Redx Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Extra Care 20 Cream with 20% urea for extra skin protection. The number's 800-345-7339. Online at uttercream.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 997. You can also find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
You can also share your own experience and thoughts about today's show. Sign up for our free online newsletter or the free podcast of the show. You'll never miss another People's Pharmacy program again, and you can share it with a friend at peoplespharmacy.com. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening, and please join us next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to the People's Pharmacy.